In November of 1930, a fur trapper named Joe Labelle snowshoed into the Inuit village of Anjikuni in the northern Canadian wilderness, expecting to find the same welcome he had received on dozens of previous visits over the past 8 years. Anjikuni was not a large settlement, perhaps 30 families, maybe 200 people total depending on the season, scattered along the western shore of Anjikuni Lake in what is now Nunavut but was then a remote corner of the Northwest Territories so isolated that the nearest trading post sat more than 50 miles to the south. Joe knew the village well. He knew the families, knew which children had been born since his last visit, knew where the best fishing spots were and which dogs were most likely to steal from your pack if you left it unattended. He had spent winter nights in Anjikuni houses, sharing meals and stories, learning enough Inuktitut to get by in conversation, becoming part of the seasonal rhythm of a community that had existed in that location for longer than anyone could precisely remember. But when Joe Labelle arrived at Anjikuni in late November of 1930, he found something that made no sense at all. The village was empty. Not abandoned in the way a place looks when people have packed up and moved on, taking their possessions and leaving behind only the structures they could not carry. Abandoned in a way that suggested the entire population had vanished in the middle of their daily activities, leaving everything exactly where it had been the moment before they disappeared. Fires still smoldering in stone hearths. Feed sitting in pots over those fires, now frozen solid but clearly having been in the process of cooking when whoever was preparing it stopped. Rifles leaning against doorframes, which made no sense because no one in that territory left weapons behind when they traveled, and no one left the village without weapons because the land between settlements could kill you in 100 different ways. Sewing projects half-finished on tables, children's toys scattered on floors, and most disturbing to Joe, the sled dogs were still there, tied to their posts, all of them dead from starvation and exposure, which meant that whatever had caused the people to leave had happened quickly enough that no one had thought to release the animals or bring them along. Joe Labelle spent 2 hours searching the village, calling out names, checking every structure, looking for any sign that might explain what he was seeing. He found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no indication of violence or struggle. Just the complete and inexplicable absence of every human being who should have been there. And according to what Joe later told authorities, what finally convinced him that something deeply wrong had occurred was the silence. The kind of silence that exists in a place where nothing living remains. No dogs barking because they were all dead. No voices because there were no people. Just wind moving through empty spaces and the sound of his own breathing growing faster as the reality of what he was looking at started to overwhelm his ability to process it rationally. Before we descend into the decades of investigation, speculation, and controversy that followed Joe Labelle's discovery, and before we examine what actually happened at Anjikuni versus what people wanted to believe happened, I need you to join this community that refuses to let these stories disappear into comfortable explanations that ignore uncomfortable facts. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments what country you are watching from, because what you are about to hear is going to challenge everything you thought you understood about how stories become legends and how legends obscure truth. Now let me take you back to November of 1930, to a frozen lake in northern Canada, where Joe Labelle was about to set in motion one of the most persistent unsolved mysteries in North American history, even though the mystery itself may be the biggest part of the problem. The first thing to understand about the Anjikuni story is that almost everything you have read about it is wrong. Not wrong in small details or in matters of interpretation, but fundamentally wrong in ways that tell us more about what people want mysterious disappearances to be than about what actually happened in northern Canada in 1930. The version of the story that has circulated in books and articles and documentaries for decades contains elements that sound compelling and strange. An entire village of 2,000 people vanishing overnight. Graves that had been dug up and emptied of bodies. Strange lights in the sky seen by witnesses in the days before the disappearance. RCMP investigations that found no trace of where the missing people had gone. These details show up repeatedly in accounts of Anjikuni, and they are all either completely fabricated or so distorted from whatever actual events they were based on that they bear no relationship to anything that can be verified through primary sources. So what actually happened? The truthful answer is that we do not know with certainty, because the primary source documentation for the Anjikuni case is fragmentary at best and possibly non-existent. There are no RCMP investigation reports that can be located in archives. There are no newspaper accounts from 1930 or 1931 that mention a missing village or a trapper named Joe Labelle making a disturbing discovery. There are no records from the Hudson's Bay Company trading posts in the region documenting an influx of Inuit refugees, who might have fled from Anjikuni to other settlements. The first published account of the Anjikuni disappearance appeared in a magazine article written by a man named Frank Edwards in 1959, almost 30 years after the supposed event, and Edwards was a writer who specialized in sensational mysteries and unexplained phenomena rather than in careful historical documentation. But the absence of contemporary documentation does not necessarily mean nothing happened. Northern Canada in 1930 was a place where entire communities could live and die without generating the kind of paper trail that historians rely on. The RCMP detachments in that territory were understaffed and operating across distances so vast that months could pass between visits to remote settlements. If a small Inuit village had relocated for reasons that made sense to the people living there, seasonal hunting patterns or a decision to consolidate with a larger community or simply a choice to move to better fishing grounds, it is entirely possible that such a relocation would not have been documented in any official record that survived to the present day. And if a fur trapper passing through that village found it empty and was disturbed by the abandonment, but then continued on his trapline and mentioned the incident only in conversation rather than in a formal report, that too might leave no documentary trace. What we can say with some confidence is that the story as it exists in popular accounts, the story of 2,000 people vanishing overnight leaving behind evidence of interrupted daily activities and mysterious circumstances, is not supported by any evidence that can be verified. The population figure alone is absurd for an Inuit settlement in that region in 1930. Communities of 2,000 people did not exist in the Canadian Arctic at that time. The largest Inuit settlements were perhaps a few hundred people, and most were much smaller, extended family groups of 20 or 30 or 50 individuals who lived together seasonally and whose locations shifted based on where game and fish could be found. The idea that a community of 2,000 could simply vanish is dramatic, but it requires believing in a settlement that was far larger than anything that actually existed in that territory in that era. Similarly, the detail about graves being emptied is almost certainly a later embellishment added to make the story more mysterious. Inuit burial practices in the early 20th century varied by region, but generally did not involve deep graves in the way that European burial customs did. In areas where the ground was permanently frozen, bodies were often placed in above-ground cairns or in shallow depressions covered with stones. The idea that someone dug up completed graves and removed bodies wholesale is both logistically implausible and unsupported by any documented Inuit cultural practice from that period. It is the kind of detail that sounds eerie and unexplained, which is exactly why it probably was added to the story by writers who were more interested in mystery than in accuracy. So if the dramatic version of Anjikuni is largely or entirely fictional, why does the story persist? Why has it been repeated in dozens of books and articles, investigated by researchers, discussed by people interested in unexplained phenomena, and generally treated as a real historical event rather than as a story that someone made up or heavily distorted? The answer has to do with what the Anjikuni story provides to people who want to believe in certain kinds of mysteries. It offers a perfect template for unexplained disappearance. Remote location, check. Indigenous people who can be portrayed as mysteriously vanishing in ways that white European observers find inexplicable, check. Lack of conventional explanation that allows for speculation about paranormal or extraterrestrial causes, check. Just enough distance in time that primary sources are difficult to verify, but not so distant that the story feels like ancient history, check. The Anjikuni story is compelling precisely because it is vague enough to accommodate almost any explanation, while being specific enough in its details to feel real. And that combination, vague causation plus specific atmospheric detail, is the hallmark of a well-constructed mystery story, rather than of a well-documented historical event. This does not mean that nothing happened at Anjikuni. It means that whatever happened has been so thoroughly obscured by decades of embellishment and speculation that recovering the actual events, if there were actual events, is probably impossible at this point. But let us assume for the sake of investigation that something did happen, that a fur trapper did arrive at a small Inuit settlement and find it abandoned in circumstances that struck him as strange. What might explain that abandonment in ways that do not require invoking mysterious forces or mass disappearances? The simplest explanation is seasonal relocation. Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic were not sedentary in the way that European settlements were. People moved regularly based on where resources could be found, and those movements were determined by factors that someone from outside the culture might not immediately recognize as significant. a change in caribou migration patterns, the freezing or thawing of a lake that affected fishing, a decision by community leadership to consolidate with relatives in another location. All of these could result in a village being abandoned on what appeared to an outside observer to be short notice. If the community left quickly, perhaps in response to weather conditions that created a brief window for travel, they might have left behind items that they intended to retrieve later or that were not worth the effort of transporting. The dead sled dogs, if that detail is accurate, could indicate that the village was hit by disease that affected the animals, and the decision to relocate was influenced by the loss of transportation. Or it could indicate that the dogs were left behind because the community was moving to a location where they would have access to other dog teams and saw no point in bringing animals that were sick or difficult to manage. The half-prepared food and the rifles leaning against walls, if those details are accurate, might simply mean that people left quickly when conditions became favorable for travel and planned to return, or they might mean that the trapper's memory of what he saw was influenced by later retellings that added dramatic details. There's also the possibility, uncomfortable for people who want Anjikuni to remain mysterious, that Joe Labelle either misunderstood what he saw or exaggerated his account in later retellings. A village that was mostly empty because the population was out on a hunting expedition could look completely abandoned to someone who arrived when no one was present. If Labelle did not speak Inuktitut fluently or did not fully understand seasonal patterns of movement, he might have interpreted a temporary absence as a permanent abandonment. And if he later recounted the story in trading posts or to other trappers, the details might have grown in the telling, the way stories do when they are repeated by people who enjoy the reaction that a good mystery generates. This is Grim Vale Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe and like the video. Don't miss what rises next from the darkness. The trajectory of the Anjikuni story after 1959, when it first appeared in published form, tells us something important about how modern legends are constructed and maintained. Frank Edwards, who wrote the first widely circulated account, was a broadcaster and author who specialized in books with titles like Stranger Than Science and Strange World, collections of purportedly true stories about unexplained phenomena that were presented in a way that emphasized mystery and strangeness over careful verification. Edwards did not claim to have spoken directly to Joe Labelle or to have access to RCMP files or to have conducted original research in Canadian archives. He presented the Anjikuni story as an established fact, something that everyone knew about but that remained unexplained, which is a rhetorical technique that bypasses the question of whether the event actually occurred by treating its existence as already proven. After Edwards published his account, other writers picked up the story and added their own elaborations. The population of the missing village grew from a realistic 30 or 50 people to several hundred and eventually to the absurd figure of 2,000. Details about RCMP investigations appeared in later accounts even though no evidence of such investigations can be found in archives. The timeline became more specific, with some versions claiming the disappearance happened in a single night, and that evidence suggested people had been in the middle of activities seconds before they vanished. Each retelling added elements that made the story more mysterious and more dramatic, and each retelling treated the previous versions as source material that could be trusted rather than as claims that needed verification. By the time the Anjikuni story reached the Internet age, it had become a firmly established modern legend, cited in lists of unexplained disappearances, discussed in forums devoted to paranormal phenomena, and presented in documentaries as an authentic historical mystery. The lack of primary source documentation was either ignored or explained away as evidence that the Canadian government was suppressing information, which conveniently transformed the absence of evidence into evidence of a cover-up. And anyone who pointed out that the story could not be verified was accused of being closed-minded or of refusing to acknowledge that strange things happen in remote places. This pattern, where a story with minimal or no factual foundation becomes accepted as true through repetition, and where skepticism is treated as resistance to mystery rather than as reasonable inquiry, is characteristic of how modern legends function in information environments where verification is difficult, and where dramatic stories spread more readily than careful corrections. The Anjikuni story persists not because evidence supports it but because it fills a need that people have for mysteries that remain unexplained. And that need is stronger than the desire for accurate information about what actually happened in northern Canada in 1930. But there is another dimension to the Anjikuni story that deserves attention, and it has to do with how narratives about Indigenous people are constructed and consumed by non-Indigenous audiences. The idea that an entire Inuit village could vanish mysteriously relies on a set of assumptions about indigenous people as somehow more connected to mysterious forces, more likely to disappear in ways that defy explanation, more other than European settlers. It exoticizes Inuit communities by turning them into props in a mystery story rather than treating them as real people whose movements and decisions were based on practical considerations and cultural knowledge that made perfect sense within their own context. If a European settlement of 30 families had relocated from one location to another in 1930, no one would describe it as a mysterious disappearance. It would be described as a town moving, which happened regularly in early 20th century North America as economic conditions changed and communities relocated to places with better opportunities. But when an Inuit community relocates, it becomes mysterious, unexplained, possibly supernatural, because the underlying assumption is that indigenous people are mysterious and their actions are inherently inexplicable to outsiders. This is not a neutral way of telling stories. It is a way of othering people by making their normal activities seem strange and by refusing to consider practical explanations that would be immediately obvious if the people involved were white Europeans. The Anjikuni story has been enthusiastically adopted by people interested in unexplained phenomena, and many of those people are not intentionally racist or trying to exoticize indigenous communities. But the story itself carries assumptions that treat Inuit people as mysterious others whose behavior cannot be understood through normal reasoning, and that is a problem regardless of the intentions of the people repeating the story. It is worth asking why stories about missing white settlers usually focus on practical questions about where they went and why, while stories about missing indigenous communities so often veer into speculation about paranormal causes or mass disappearances that defy explanation. The reality is that Inuit communities in 1930 were dealing with enormous pressures and changes. The fur trade was disrupting traditional seasonal patterns. Contact with European diseases was devastating populations that had no immunity. Government policies were beginning to impose structures and expectations that conflicted with traditional ways of living. The residential school system was removing children from families and communities. Economic changes were making it harder to sustain traditional subsistence practices. In that context, a community deciding to relocate, to consolidate with relatives elsewhere, to move closer to a trading post or farther from government interference, was not mysterious. It was adaptive behavior in response to very real pressures. If Anjikuni was abandoned in 1930, the most likely explanation is not that everyone vanished, but that everyone left, and they left for reasons that made perfect sense to them even if those reasons were not immediately apparent to a fur trapper passing through. And if we have no documentation of where they went or why, that tells us more about whose movements were considered worth documenting in 1930s Canada than it tells us about mysterious disappearances. The question of whether Joe Labelle actually existed and actually made the discovery he is said to have made is one that cannot be definitively answered with the information available. No contemporary records confirm his existence, but that is not unusual for fur trappers working in remote territories in the early 20th century. Many such men lived their entire lives without generating the kind of documentation that would survive in archives. They worked independently or for small outfits that kept minimal records. They moved through territories that were sparsely populated and far from centers of administration. It is entirely possible that a man named Joe Labelle worked as a trapper in the Northwest Territories in 1930, and that his encounter with an abandoned village was real but was never officially documented. It is also possible that Joe Labelle is a fictional creation or a composite of multiple people, invented by Frank Edwards or by whoever first told him the story. Without contemporary documentation, we cannot know. And that uncertainty is itself significant, because it demonstrates how thin the evidentiary foundation for the entire Anjikuni story actually is. We are being asked to believe in a mass disappearance based on a single account that appeared 30 years after the supposed event, attributed to a person whose existence cannot be confirmed, describing circumstances that contradict what we know about population sizes and settlement patterns in the region. That is not evidence. It is folklore. But folklore serves purposes that evidence does not. Folklore provides narratives that help people make sense of things that frighten or confuse them. It creates stories that can be shared and elaborated and adapted to serve different needs in different contexts. The Anjikuni story has been used to support theories about alien abduction, about government experiments, about portals to other dimensions, about ancient indigenous knowledge of forces that modern science does not understand. Each of these interpretations takes the core story and builds on it in ways that reflect the concerns and interests of the people doing the interpreting. For people interested in UFOs, Anjikuni becomes evidence of mass abduction, with the strange lights in the sky that appear in some versions serving as proof that extraterrestrial craft were involved. For people suspicious of government secrecy, Anjikuni becomes evidence of a cover-up, with the absence of official records proof that authorities removed documentation to hide what they knew. For people interested in indigenous spirituality, Anjikuni becomes evidence of shamanic practices or knowledge that allowed an entire community to vanish into another realm. None of these interpretations is supported by evidence, but all of them use the Anjikuni story as a foundation for speculation that confirms pre-existing beliefs. This is how modern legends function. They are not primarily about the events they claim to describe. They are about providing frameworks for people to explore ideas that matter to them, using stories that are ambiguous enough to accommodate multiple interpretations. And the Anjikuni story is exceptionally well suited to this purpose because its lack of verification means it can be molded to fit almost any theory without being constrained by inconvenient facts. The impact of the Anjikuni story on how people think about disappearances and unexplained events is worth considering. The story has been cited as evidence in countless discussions about mysterious vanishings, often alongside other cases that have stronger documentation, but are treated as equivalent because they all share the common element of people disappearing in circumstances that seem strange. By including Anjikuni in lists of unexplained disappearances, writers and researchers implicitly vouch for its credibility, and that credibility then spreads to other contexts where the story is referenced. This creates a feedback loop where the story becomes more credible simply through repetition, even though the underlying evidence never improves. Someone reading their 10th or 20th reference to Anjikuni is likely to assume that such a frequently cited case must be well documented, because why else would so many people be talking about it? The possibility that everyone citing the case is relying on the same questionable source material does not occur to most readers, and the writers citing the case often have not checked primary sources themselves, but are instead relying on previous published accounts that they assume were properly researched. The result is that the Anjikuni story has achieved a status in popular consciousness that is completely disconnected from its evidentiary foundation. It is treated as historical fact by people who have never examined whether any evidence supports it. And that disconnect between belief and evidence is precisely what makes the story valuable as a case study in how modern legends are constructed and maintained. If we set aside the question of what actually happened and focus instead on what the Anjikuni story tells us about how we think about mystery and disappearance, several patterns emerge. First, we are more willing to accept mysterious explanations for events that occur in remote places, because remoteness itself seems to justify the idea that normal rules do not apply. Second, we are more willing to accept mysterious explanations for events involving people we perceive as other, because otherness seems to correlate with inexplicability in ways that reinforce existing assumptions about who is mysterious and who is normal. Third, we are more willing to accept stories that lack documentation if those stories confirm beliefs we already hold about the existence of unexplained phenomena, because confirmation feels more valuable than verification. These patterns are not unique to the Anjikuni story. They appear in many narratives about unexplained disappearances, mysterious deaths, and paranormal events. And recognizing these patterns is important because it helps us understand why certain kinds of stories persist regardless of whether evidence supports them. The Anjikuni story persists because it provides something that people want, which is a mystery that remains mysterious, a disappearance that resists explanation, a narrative that confirms that the world contains forces and events that exceed our understanding. But wanting something to be true is not the same as that thing being true. And the distinction between those two categories matters, especially when the stories we tell involve real people whose lives and experiences are being turned into entertainment or speculation. If Anjikuni was a real place and real people lived there, they deserve to have their story told accurately rather than being turned into props in a mystery narrative that serves the needs of people who never knew them and who care more about maintaining the mystery than about understanding what actually happened. This is Grimvale Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe and like the video. Don't miss what rises next from the darkness. The question of how to approach stories like Anjikuni in an age where verification is theoretically easier than it has ever been but where misinformation spreads faster than correction is one that extends far beyond this single case. We live in a time when anyone can publish anything to a global audience without editorial oversight or fact-checking, and when algorithms reward content that generates engagement rather than content that is accurate. In that environment, stories like Anjikuni thrive because they generate engagement. They are shared, discussed, debated, referenced, and each active engagement spreads the story further regardless of whether the engagement is supportive or skeptical. The people who research and write about Anjikuni with genuine curiosity are not doing anything wrong by being interested in the story. Curiosity about mysteries is a reasonable human impulse, and the desire to understand what happened in cases where documentation is limited or contradictory is legitimate. The problem is not the curiosity. The problem is the willingness to accept extraordinary claims based on minimal evidence, and the tendency to treat the absence of debunking as equivalent to confirmation. If someone claims that an entire village disappeared mysteriously, the burden of proof is on the person making that claim to provide evidence that supports it. The absence of evidence disproving the claim is not evidence supporting it. And in the case of Anjikuni, we have no contemporary documentation of the event, no verified witnesses, no RCMP records, no newspaper accounts, and no archaeological or anthropological evidence that a settlement matching the description ever existed in the location described. What we have is a story that first appeared 30 years after it supposedly happened, told by a writer who specialized in sensational mysteries, containing details that contradict what we know about population sizes and settlement patterns in the region. That is not enough to support the claim that an entire village vanished mysteriously. It is barely enough to support the claim that something unusual happened. And yet the story has been repeated thousands of times as if it were established historical fact, cited as evidence in discussions about paranormal phenomena, and used as a foundation for speculation about alien abduction, government conspiracies, and dimensional portals. The gap between the evidence and the conclusions people have drawn from it is enormous, and that gap is itself the most interesting aspect of the entire case. The Anjikuni story reveals how easily narratives can become detached from factual foundations when those narratives serve psychological or cultural needs that are more powerful than the desire for accurate information. People want to believe in mysteries. They want to believe that the world contains events that resist explanation. They want to believe that there are forces and phenomena that science has not yet accounted for. And stories like Anjikuni provide confirmation of those beliefs in ways that feel concrete and specific, even when the underlying evidence is vague and unverifiable. This is not to say that unexplained events do not occur. The world is complex and our understanding of it is incomplete. There are certainly events that have occurred and that remain unexplained because we lack sufficient information to determine what happened. But the existence of genuinely unexplained events does not justify treating every story about mysterious disappearances as credible simply because we want mysteries to exist. It requires distinguishing between cases where evidence suggests something unusual occurred and we genuinely do not know what, versus cases where the absence of evidence is being misinterpreted as evidence of mystery. Anjikuni falls clearly into the second category. We do not have evidence that anything unusual happened. We have a story claiming that something unusual happened, and that story cannot be verified through primary sources. Those are very different things, and treating them as equivalent is a mistake that undermines our ability to think clearly about which mysteries are worth investigating and which are folklore masquerading as history. The legacy of the Anjikuni story is that it has become a touchstone in discussions about unexplained disappearances, cited alongside cases that have much stronger documentation as if all mysterious disappearance stories are equivalent. This creates a kind of credibility by association, where weak cases are elevated by being discussed in the same context as stronger ones, and where the overall impression is that mysterious disappearances happen frequently enough to constitute a pattern that demands explanation. But if half the cases in that pattern are folklore or misrepresentation or exaggeration, then the pattern itself is an artifact of how we tell stories rather than a genuine phenomenon that requires explanation. The truth about Anjikuni, insofar as we can determine it from the available evidence, is almost certainly mundane. Either nothing happened and the entire story is fiction, or something relatively ordinary happened. A small Inuit community relocated for practical reasons, and that ordinary event was transformed through retelling into a mysterious disappearance that has captured imaginations for decades. Neither of those possibilities is as satisfying as the idea that an entire village vanished overnight, leaving behind evidence of interrupted lives and unexplained circumstances. But satisfaction is not the same as truth, and our preference for one narrative over another does not change which narrative is supported by evidence. What remains valuable about examining the Anjikuni story is not the mystery itself, which almost certainly does not exist, but what the story reveals about how we construct and consume narratives about mystery. We prefer stories that resist closure. We prefer explanations that invoke forces beyond normal understanding. We prefer narratives that confirm our existing beliefs about the world being stranger and more mysterious than conventional wisdom acknowledges. And we are willing to accept remarkably thin evidence in support of stories that satisfy those preferences, while demanding extraordinarily strong evidence to accept conventional explanations that we find less satisfying. The Anjikuni story has persisted for decades, not because evidence supports it, but because it serves these psychological and cultural functions effectively. It is a well-constructed mystery story that provides just enough detail to feel real while remaining vague enough to accommodate multiple interpretations. It involves people who are foreign enough to be mysterious but recent enough to feel relevant. It takes place in a location that is remote enough to seem plausible as a site of unexplained events, but not so remote that it feels disconnected from the modern world. And it has been repeated often enough that it has achieved the status of established fact simply through familiarity. But familiarity is not the same as accuracy. And the fact that a story has been repeated thousands of times does not make it true. The Anjikuni mystery is not a mystery of what happened to missing people. It is a mystery of how a story with no verified factual foundation became one of the most frequently cited examples of unexplained disappearance in popular culture. And solving that mystery requires understanding not what happened in northern Canada in 1930, but what happens when people want to believe in mysteries more than they want to verify facts. If there is a lesson in the Anjikuni story, it is that skepticism is not the opposite of curiosity. Skepticism is what allows curiosity to remain focused on discovering truth rather than on confirming beliefs. Being skeptical about claims that lack evidence does not mean refusing to acknowledge that strange things happen. It means insisting that before we accept that something strange happened, we need better evidence than a single uncorroborated account that appeared decades after the supposed event and that contains details that contradict what we know about the context in which the event supposedly occurred. The people who lived in the Canadian Arctic in 1930 were real people dealing with real challenges in a landscape that was beautiful and harsh and unforgiving. If a community relocated from one place to another, they did so for reasons that made sense within their understanding of how to survive and thrive in that environment. Those reasons might not be immediately obvious to outsiders, but that does not make them mysterious. It makes them the product of knowledge and experience that outsiders lack, and treating their movements as inexplicable mysteries rather than as practical decisions made by people responding to circumstances they understood better than we do is a form of disrespect that turns real people into characters in someone else's story. The truth about Anjikuni is probably something ordinary. A village that relocated. A trapper who found it empty and was disturbed by the abandonment. A story that grew in the telling until it became something that bore no relationship to the ordinary events that inspired it. That is not as dramatic as mysterious disappearances and unexplained vanishings, but it is almost certainly closer to what actually happened. And recognizing that is not a defeat for curiosity or wonder. It is a victory for understanding how the world actually works versus how we sometimes wish it worked. The stories that matter most are not always the ones that sound most mysterious. Sometimes they are the ones that teach us to distinguish between mystery and mythology, between the genuinely unexplained and the merely unverified, between events that deserve investigation and stories that deserve skepticism. The Anjikuni mystery teaches us that lesson, if we are willing to learn it, not by providing answers about what happened in 1930, but by forcing us to ask better questions about how we evaluate evidence and what we accept as true. And those questions matter far more than whether an Inuit village vanished mysteriously or relocated practically, because those questions determine whether we understand the world as it is only as we imagine it to be.